So now, okay, port wine, there is really something completely different. And it's quite a bit of a story, and I want to take a couple of minutes to fill you in on how it all started. I don't mean Churchills, I mean port. And the reason came, it was about 1701 or 1702, and Great Britain was always fighting the French, always. And yet, they said to hell with this because the British are buying French wine all the time. We've actually got to maybe put a little stopper in this, and the only way the government does is manoeuvring the taxes. So they looked around for somebody they could favour, and it fell on their oldest ally in the continent, that was Portugal. And so they said, okay, we're going to favour Portuguese wine from here on in, because the tax will go right down and the tax on the French wine is going to soar. And we're trying to put money our allies' ways as opposed to our permanent enemies. So that was the start of the thing in about 1702. Nothing much happens. You had to be either quite cheap or a patriot to drink it, because lo and behold, they picked the area in Portugal. Whether it was the Portuguese, history doesn't relate, but it was in the north, but by the coast. So it's a green wine area right now. And the initial red Portugal, which is what the thing was called, was actually Vinho Verde Tinto, which is not everybody's cup of tea. You know, a lot of Portuguese drink it, but it's not a very big export. You know, to foreigners who are more used to ripe wines. And so, luckily, it did. I mean, these things always lasted quite a long time in those days, you know, because the world moved slowly. But by about 1880, the world of Portugal had changed, and now this is the moment I've been waiting for, because unlike you guys who've been relaxed, I've had to wear the tie and everything to keep things hidden, and I've been desperate to get all this stuff on. And I will, just to show you where it all happens. And actually all that happened is it did not move south, it just moved inland, and it moved over a mountain range which separates the coastal plain from the inland. And so it is a much more, and it's called the Douro after the Douro Superior, after the river that runs along the bottom of it. And you'll find that it is a land of complete extremes compared to the coast. The coast is very temperate, but inside here, and we're here, the coast is here. But this is exaggerated a bit, but in fact, it's really this bit, because the Douro region itself, I mean, for making port now, is centred on a town called Régua, which is well inland from Porto. It's not quite as far as Pinhão. Pinhão is more the centre of where vintage port may come from. But that, at least, it doesn't show you actually, it's not really relative as to how far from the sea it is. But this chain of hills cuts it off from the coastal temperate region. And so actually, the Douro in the summer, it can be blazing hot. You know, this year, which was a very hot year, you know, you can have days of 40 degrees, 41 degrees. And in the winter, you know, you probably don't get very much snow falling on, but there'll be snow in the mountains maybe a little, and there'll be certainly all kinds of days where it's freezing. So it is, whereas down on the coast, close to the Atlantic, it's much, much more temperate. So, okay, here you've got the thing to be able to deliver to you something which is ripe enough to even contemplate making port. And they moved in there about 1780. By 1830 to 40, certainly by 1840, the argument was all over, and port was established as it is today as a fortified wine, you know, where the fermentation is stopped by adding alcohol to preserve some sugar. and therefore you've got a fortified wine which is adding the brandy, and it's done to preserve some degree of sugar. Now, the way it started, of course, it all came about quite naturally in that you get an extra hot summer, and you get probably grapes, let's say, grown in less controlled fashion than you're getting today. It's not hard to imagine the grape sugar content going up to 17.5%. It's unlikely to get there now. I mean, most table wine grapes get up to, 14.5 in this area because it's hot and they can get ripe. But they could run wild, and when you get something like that, probably at about 14% alcohol, created naturally by fermentation, it's probably enough on a normal year to certainly temporarily stop the fermentation, if not for good and ever. And lo and behold, people would have suddenly, actually for the first time, had a taste of wine that actually had residual sugar. It might not be a stable product, because it could probably start fermenting all over again, because there's probably some unfermented yeast still in the mixture. But probably if it got up high enough, it was enough that people then started to see what artificially stopped fermented wine could taste like, and they found they liked it. Particularly the people in England, and remember, and the people in England, and remember we're talking about British colonies in those days as well, and we're talking about Portugal and its colonies. Now the Portuguese, all their colonies were in the equator, in Central Africa and over in Asia and whatever. And actually probably the coldest place in the whole of the Portuguese system was where port was made. Everything else was warmer. But for Britain and the British Empire, there was a huge amount. There was Britain, there was Canada, there was Australia. There's all kinds of population centres where in the winter it gets down cold. And lo and behold, that sweeter thing appeals in cold temperatures. It's less appealing, in the equator because it's too hot. And that's why the Brits actually started latching in on port wine. Now, it didn't take long. I mean, it was about 1840, it was all over, probably by 1830. But what they do, and I was mentioning it a little to somebody today, is the difference between sherry, for instance, is that in port, you start with the grapes, you pick them, you put them in the stone tank, and you tread them, and they start to ferment. Now, they can go to 14% quite easily. They could probably go as high as 17%, but not easily. But the winemakers these days, they have it calculated out that they actually stop the fermentation by running the thing out of the stone tank down into a vat that you're adding raw brandy to, grape brandy, and you bring the alcoholic content up to about 20% alcohol, which is what port is, and that is completely stable. Fermentation will not take place there. So now, port wine is stabilised completely, and the trick is to judge how quickly it's going to run out, because it's fermenting all the time in the stone tank where you've actually trodden it, and it's fermenting all the time it empties, and the trick is to judge how long it's going to take to get into the brandy and then stop.